Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, dear friends and colleagues. We are welcoming you today to the UN Decade Satellite event, Policy and Management for Addressing Climate Ocean Change, which is being co-hosted as part of the UN Ocean Decade Laboratory Series, A Healthy and Resilient Ocean. And today, we're here to talk a little bit more in depth about the UN Decade endorsed OARS program, or the Ocean Acidification Research for Sustainability program, which broadly aims to expand OA monitoring and research that help decision makers better understand climate impacts to marine resources and explore local actions that increase resilience. And my name is Jessie Turner. I am the director of the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here co-hosting this event with friends and partners that many of you probably recognize from the Ocean Foundation. That's Dr. Kaitlyn Lowder, Ms. Alexis Valauri-Orton, and Ms. Bobbi-Jo Dobush. I will introduce our presentations here in a bit. And we are here together going to highlight our unique obligations, both the Alliance obligation as well as the Ocean Foundation obligation, as implementing partners of the OARS program. And specifically, that includes identifying evidence and information needs for OA mitigation and adaptation, as well as strengthening feedback loops that promote application of OA knowledge by policymakers and end users. And as you can see, those really go hand in hand, and you can't do one without the other, well, anyhow. And so we are hoping that this is going to serve broadly as an introduction to the OARS program, but also as an opportunity to share resources, products, toolkits, and supports that the OA Alliance and the Ocean Foundation have been developing, likely in partnership with some of you or even many of you on the line today. And before we begin, I do want to just take a moment to acknowledge or simply acknowledge the moment that we are in as a global community. Broadly speaking, it has been a rough couple of years, to say the least, and likely at certain points we have all continued to feel and experience pain, frustration, fear, and some uncertainty. And I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of our co-host that it has really been a bright spot and an absolute privilege to be part of the global OA community and the network of dedicated experts and practitioners over the last couple of years. While the work ahead can really seem daunting, it does give us great optimism to be part of this effort with you and building this really authentic and really impactful community of practice. And your co-hosts today are very grateful for the sustained leadership and engagement. So we'll have 4 presentations for you today. We'll begin by turning it over to Dr. Kaitlyn Lowder with Ocean Foundation, who's going to give us a very brief overview of the OARS program and sort of contextualize what does it even mean to think about knowledge to OA action and give us some broad concept for thinking about that. From there, I'll give a quick presentation on identifying evidence needs and knowledge gaps for decision making. We'll move on to Ms. Alexis Valauri-Orton talking about OA policy development and tools for leveraging investment and creation of policy. And then finally over to Bobbi-Jo Dobush, who's going to give us a little bit of a synthesis of some of the OA policy that has been created at different scales to date. And then we'll stand for questions and hopefully invite engagement from all of you into the OARS community. So Kaitlyn, we'll go ahead and turn off our screens and I will share your slides and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessie. I'm really excited to kick us off today to talk about policy and management for addressing climate ocean change as part of this healthy and resilient ocean laboratory. Wonderful. Next slide, please. So I'll share a little bit about the Oceanification Research for Sustainability, or OARS program. It's a decade program of the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network, or GOA-ON. They are providing society with observational science, evidence needed to sustainably identify, monitor, mitigate, and adapt to oceanification with a focus from local all the way to global scales. Some of their objectives include coordination of capacity building in science, communication and delivery of the outputs to policymakers and communities, identifying data and evidence needs for mitigation and adaptation strategies, ensuring that science is prioritized, proactively designing and implementing observation strategies to ensure that vulnerable areas have adequate monitoring, which we'll talk a little bit about more today, And then I'll also note that they have another satellite event in this decade laboratory tomorrow, Oceanification and Multiple Stressors. So keep an eye out for that at 8 a.m. Central European time tomorrow. Next slide, Jessie. So this collective effort is necessary given the recent IPCC reports that have shown strong evidence of these changing ocean conditions. At the representative concentration pathway that we are on track for, we can expect drastic ocean changes, not only in ocean warming, this top figure you see here, but also in oceanification. And as more CO2 dissolves into the ocean, reacts to lower the pH and alter the chemistry of our oceans. And the latest assessment report 6, working group 1, which is the physical science basis, says it is virtually certain that human-caused CO2 emissions are the main driver of current global acidification of the surface open ocean. Next slide, please. So while we're certain of these changes in the global ocean, there remain gaps in our understanding of nearshore coastal conditions. OARS and our work at the Ocean Foundation has been focused on increasing monitoring efforts by these countries. You can see here a figure of OARS membership in 2013, with large gaps in monitoring and membership of many coastal countries. Next slide, please. But here in 2021, you can see that membership has greatly increased around the globe. So there's been a lot of effort to continue building this community. Next slide, please. And part of that has been through our work here at the Ocean Foundation in terms of increasing global capacity for coastal oceanification monitoring. That's been through the provision of go-on-in-a-box kits, which include a suite of equipment that scientists can use to deploy in the environment and get high-quality coastal carbonate measurements, and then bring samples back to the lab and perform measurements based on established best practices to then get high-quality data as well to monitor oceanification. So not only are we providing these kits of equipment, but associated with that is hands-on training, like you see here on the screen, so that the scientists have the best understanding to perform these sorts of measurements. And then, of course, long-term support, too, to ensure that this monitoring persists over the long term. Next slide, please. So even with this effort, there remains a number of questions about the impacts of oceanification. Research over the last 15 years or so has shown direct effects on survival of marine organisms, growth, reproduction. And we're also learning more about functional effects of oceanification. What does a change in calcification mean for how the shell of a crab responds to a predator that's trying to feed upon it? Or what does reduced chemosensory capabilities mean for a salmon's ability to avoid its predator? And of course, all of this feeds into rates of predation and food acquisition in the environment, which in turn becomes part of the ecosystem function. It becomes a challenge to model these sorts of effects without these sources of data to understand. And some of the organisms that are most affected by oceanification are critical components of the food web, such as the pteropods up at the top of the picture here, or corals. And as these key links die, ripple effects will be felt throughout the ocean ecosystems. And in total, all of these changes will lead to loss of biodiversity in some regions or contribute to unstable ecosystem regimes. And we're especially lacking in this information ecosystems with high levels of biodiversity and habitat forming species such as coral reefs, because these are in locations where researchers don't have as many resources to be able to monitor and study these sorts of effects. Next slide, please. And then as we think about some of the sociocultural implications of oceanification, that can be a strong driver of bringing us to action on oceanification from the local to the more regional scale. Some of the impacts we might expect are impacts to direct harvest, those that are harvesting shellfish, fishers, or pearl farmers. There can also be impacts to business and community services based on the infrastructure that's needed to process the fish or move further down into the supply chain. And then we can think about ecosystem service impacts as well. For example, coral reefs provide strong physical protection against storm surge, tourism income, and then of course, cultural value for many resources across our global ocean. And then there can be impacts to food and international security as well, as the provision of protein declines. We might be concerned about increases in conflict throughout our world. And so all of this provides strong motivation to do more together, which I am so glad we are working on together throughout this ocean decade through OARS, bringing all of our collective expertise together here at the OA Alliance, the Ocean Foundation, and so many of our partners all into this wonderful program to begin addressing some of these areas of concern. Next slide, please. And so given these impacts, there remains the need to assess certain interventions throughout the decade and beyond. Now, what can we do to adapt our aquaculture or fishery practices? Can we turn towards farming species that are perhaps less vulnerable, or co-locate certain species together that maybe have benefits in a changing ocean? Protecting specific areas is incredibly important, whether it's marine protected areas or something on a larger scale, to avoid some of those external stressors, perhaps such as fishing, that may also be co-affecting some of these areas. And then here at the Ocean Foundation, we're focused on deploying nature-based solutions as well, whether that's restoring seagrass or mangrove habitat. It's not only important for blue carbon, but also for important habitats for some of these species that are most affected by these changing ocean conditions. And then, of course, we can continue to think about the reduction of exacerbators, such as eutrophication. And so I'm sure there'll be more information on that too with the multi-stressor satellite event tomorrow. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Jessie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kaitlyn, for that overview, and really also thrilled to be part of the OARS program, bringing everybody together in this way. And that was a great, let's see, I think I can stop share. There we are. That was a great context setting for the next set of presentations, and really getting into now this question of, what does it mean to identify evidence or information needs or gaps in information to be most useful for response strategies. Excuse me, I'm trying to close this out. So I'll go ahead and jump in with my slides here, and apologies, multitasking. That's me. Great. So as mentioned, I'm just going to jump in and highlight that the OARS outcome that the Alliance will be co-championing is to help identify data and evidence needs, which I'm calling in this presentation or throughout this presentation, information needs for decision making. And of course, as we know, relevant information is really the foundation for taking meaningful local and regional action. And as many of you know, the Alliance was created in 2016 by subnational governments in direct response to some of the first ever observed impacts of ocean acidification on oyster hatchery production across the Pacific coast of North America. And I just want to highlight this up front because I think it helps set the scene that when we're talking about data and evidence needs or information needs for management and for response, we're really often talking about very tangible operations, places, and people. And so we're trying to go from this global landscape and these global trends in open ocean changes to something that's much more, that has a lot more contact, I would say, probably with the coastline. So if you have worked with us, you know that the Alliance is comprised of multiple types of actors, national, state, tribal, city, port governments even, as well as non-government affiliate members that help to advance knowledge, science, and communication around this issue. And it's really the ongoing conversations across these actors that are helping to inform the possible answers to questions like, what is the data, evidence, and information that governments, managers, industry, communities are going to need in order to meaningfully understand and respond to OA. And throughout the OARS program and throughout the next decade, these discussions will evolve and must increasingly reflect the concerns, priorities, interests, and questions of these types of end users. And if you've worked with the Alliance, then you also know that the one way that we try to advance this discussion is by encouraging our members to create OA action plans, which we understand as any written policy, plan, process, or even an inventory of activities that might relate to mitigating, responding, or communicating about OA. And through toolkits, support products, we have tried to condense relevant OA activities down into more knowable and trackable pieces that ideally have some bearing on existing government priorities and programs. And just to enumerate them quickly, they include things like reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions, of course, the #1 cause of ocean acidification, advancing scientific understanding, reducing local pollutions that exacerbate coastal conditions, protecting the environment and coastal communities from impacts, expanding public awareness, and sustaining and supporting international and multi-governmental action. Again, we talk about scales, local to global. And it's our view that by creating these action plans in whatever form that takes, partners in the region are going to have an increased ability to take inventory of regional knowledge and observations. And this is really the crux of what our commitment is through OARS here, to outline processes for identifying and filling knowledge gaps. And yes, these are often going to include spatial and temporal monitoring coverage to identify trends. But what else? And I think that's really the challenging question that we are all starting to have sort of as a community of practice. And as again, that needs to be informed by specific actors. And one thing I really want to highlight here, and that we'll be trying to advance discussions around through OARS and all of our sort of collective programs, is that a knowledge gap is not necessarily a data gap. And that there are some instances, maybe a lot of instances, where more data will be needed to inform a particular risk and evaluate a specific response strategy. But increasingly, we really need governments, seafood harvesters, resource managers, and other relevant actors to help us target the information that's going to be most important and really most applicable to their operations and to their existing authorities. And that sort of helps train this question a little bit more concretely. One way we can do this is thinking about engaging broader stakeholders. And then again, really honing in on thinking about the management strategies or authorities that are most applicable to mitigating, remediating impacts of ocean acidification. And to help shepherd these discussions, we've created templates like this, getting started on an OA action plan, which highlights process steps as well as key questions, which will steer the dialogue to be a little bit more applicable to local knowledge, priorities, and activities. And again, trying to get this global picture and train it at a local level. And I quickly want to run through some of these key questions that we have sort of framed up that should inform an action plan or inform an action plan process. And also, I think they are parallel to the question, what type of information is needed for meaningful OA mitigation, adaptation, and response at a local level? So the first may be somewhat obvious, but what are the species or ecosystems that may be impacted in my region, and why are they important? And at the highest level, making an inventory of key species that are important in your region to help narrow down a couple aspects. One, are there species impact studies that already exist that might inform vulnerability or might inform thinking about vulnerability? And second, they help train on further prioritization of research in your area. Maybe local universities are already studying climate impacts to some of these species or ecosystem functioning, and funding might be directed to further expand this work. Just examples. The second big question is, how is OA different than other climate issues? And really, is there anything we can be doing now that's going to be making a difference? I think most people don't assume there are any relevant intervention strategies available for limiting the impact of OA and building resilience. And increasingly, I think it's important that we clearly articulate the message. Yes, we need to reduce carbon emissions, the #1 cause of ocean acidification. And there are things that governments and institutions can and should be doing now. And a big aspect here is a little bit, to some extent, around the messaging that it's possible to acknowledge uncertainty and also build motivation for action. And further, that we are at a place now that we are not going to have perfect information. And what this means, that identifying and prioritizing the most relevant information, knowledge gaps, is crucial for outlining a path forward. So how do we prioritize? There's only so much time and money. Where do we begin? How are we assessing risk and vulnerability to what and to whom? And really in the region, are there who are the experts who can help us outline the research needs that's going to have the most practical applicability and help us identify the best investments. And I bet a lot of people on this call have ideas about this, about what is that community of actors that can help train in on the local priorities and how to get the right people involved to sit around the same table for that purpose. And again, important to underscore that engaging those resource managers, industry partners, governments, and helping to inform that discussion about what's most applicable to their operations and to their existing management authorities is really a very important aspect in getting that local knowledge filled out. How does OA fit into existing monitoring or management frameworks? So often governments already have climate change mitigation or adaptation strategies, ocean and shoreline management goals, water quality indicators, criteria, reef resilience strategies, pollution control measures. The question that we really want local communities, local governments to be asking is, how might local OA information change, enhance, or challenge some of these existing strategies? And further, are these strategies sufficient if they are not accounting for climate ocean change impacts like ocean acidification, warming, and deoxygenation? And broadly, just to provide a snapshot for purposes of where we're headed with these types of discussions, what OA information might provide? Well, here's a pretty quick rundown. We talked about specific or unique vulnerabilities. Helping to indicate areas of refugia or more sensitive areas. Starting to explore where aquatic vegetation is potentially useful for remediating impacts of OA. Thinking about the ability to better manage human activities, and that means both terrestrial as well as marine activities in a way that can reduce co-occurring stressors. Again, this is really about improving and clarifying that land and coastal decision-making interaction. Determinations about whether hatchery or other grow-out systems of freshwater pond aquaculture might be needed in some instances, why and where. Further informing predictions for reef conditions or stock assessments. That's one thing that local OA knowledge might help inform. And then finally, not to be understated, simply an increased understanding of OA and other indicators of climate ocean change across multiple government agencies and communities and actors is a really important aspect of this work. So this is what OA information might provide. Why is this important? Well, ideally, all of this information will, at the highest level, continue to develop a more comprehensive approach to climate risk analysis and preparedness. Is going to help better integrate climate, ocean, coastal policies. We want to strengthen the connection between community priorities, science, and effective management in one location. Again, prioritizing studies, strengthening funding support, and then finally, all of this work really helps to implement existing climate and ocean commitments across things like the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, UNFCCC, and other primary agreements or frameworks that national governments and some national governments are increasingly party to. So finally, we just have wanted to show another product and support tool that groups like the Alliance have put together to try to help facilitate these discussions. What do policymakers need to know about acidification and who's considered an OA policymaker? Most people would not consider themselves an OA policymaker, but they might be surprised. And so trying to begin discussions with this in mind, again, bringing them in early to help frame what knowledge and information is most useful to their purview. So finally, what will the Alliance do to support the OARS program under the decade? Well, a lot more information sharing, more or less, as you have heard, continuing to convene these discussions around what it means to identify data and evidence needs for decision-making. And really, that's a lot of sharing of experiences, sharing of processes that have been put forward, and continuing to advance this community of practice along this particular line of thinking. So with that, I will turn it over to Alexis to move us into how all of this might be pulled into a more concrete policy or something a little bit more robust from a government perspective.
Alexis, you're muted, at least on my end.
Oh, thank you. I didn't unmute myself. I said thank you to Jessie and said thank you to all of those who are here. And she is just finishing pulling up my slides. Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to speak about the OARS outcome that the Ocean Foundation is co-champion of, which really focuses on developing policies, and specifically science-based ocean acidification policies. And I like to think of this often as strengthening the science policy feedback loop. So there's a good back and forth dialogue and conversation between those entities and really feeding into science-based policy. Next slide, please. So what is OARS outcome 7? So OARS has 7 outcomes. These are located, you can read all about the OARS program and the design of it and really the goals. The OARS program has a page on GoOn's website. So I'm going to just briefly, this is the description of outcome 7, which is to develop strategies and solutions to enable countries and regions to include measures to reduce ocean acidification in their respective legislation. And notably, this outcome is based on achieving outcomes 1 through 6. Now, you heard about one of the other outcomes from Jessie, but largely, we really do need a lot of information and global coordination in order to have effective policy. So the OARS program is self-referential, but also really strategic in how it's shaped itself. This particular outcome, we have been asked by OARS leadership, is co-championed by the Ocean Foundation, as well as the Commonwealth Blue Charter. Next slide, please. So who is the Ocean Foundation in this context? You've heard from my colleague, Kaitlyn, but I'll share a little bit about our International Ocean Acidification Initiative, which essentially is the group that is the co-champion of this effort. And this is a program within the Ocean Foundation that was launched around the time that we were founded. And it focuses on helping vulnerable human communities monitor changes in ocean chemistry, understand the risks that those changes pose, and respond to the effects of those changes with good policy based on good science. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does OA policy look like? What do we mean when we talk about OA policy? There's a lot of different forms that this can take, but at the end of the day, effective OA policy needs to incorporate, best available data and understanding, needs to ensure sustainable funding for any actions that it is recommending, promote international cooperation, recognizing that there is this sort of ecosystem of agreements and partners engaged. And then to get at that point, Jessie was commenting on, local to global scales. I think Kaitlyn also brought this up, considering the local realities for adaptation and mitigation. So examples of policy actions could include a study bill, meaning we don't think we have enough information. So we think we need to call legally for more information to be collected and shared to help us understand what is happening with regards to ocean acidification. Should a government agency or in this case, a legislature feel like they have enough information to make to take action, they may be able to implement adaptation measures, whether that be, shifts in aquaculture practices based on projections, changes in marine resource use based on understandings of vulnerability, et cetera, or mitigation, where this is basically reducing the causes, right? And on a local scale, there are very effective mitigation methods, whether that be reducing a nutrient pollution into the local estuary. That can actually have quite a significant effect on the overall acidification picture by affecting processes that many call coastal acidification. Now, there can be legislative actions, but there can also be executive actions, right? So this is something that maybe an agency within a government or the executive office, in the case of US states, that might be the governor's office, in national examples, that might be the Ministry of Marine Resources. And that can be anything from, codifying OA as a priority area, and like having, in the US, we call them interagency working groups. We have one here about ocean acidification. That's really an executive, well, actually that was mandated legislatively, but is kind of carried forth at an executive level. An executive office might also commission an OA action plan, as you heard about from Jessie, really laying out the state of affairs and the needs, and then supporting implementation of international commitments. It's typically, those executive offices that are responsible for reporting on things like the Sustainable Development Goals, or reporting on the nationally determined contributions for the UNFCCC framework. Next slide, please. So in practice, what does it look like to strengthen that science policy feedback loop? And I think Martine might be on the call, so I apologize if you feel called out, Martine, but I think this story is just really effective. Actually, he's not here, so I don't have to worry about embarrassing him or shedding too much light on the story. But Martine is a leading scientist in Mexico. He's been studying ocean acidification for a number of years, and he told me a story about, what he thought would be that sort of threshold for change in Mexico. And it was, I think, about 10 years ago that he and a group of collaborators throughout the entire west coast of North America published a paper in Science where they, I think it was Science, where they were able to, define trends in ocean acidification. And he thought, we did it. We published this paper, and now the Mexican government is going to pay attention to this issue because we've published in an extremely reputable journal. We have excellent data. We can really show what's happening. And needless to say, his phone did not ring. And then a few years ago, the Ocean Foundation had conversations with different legislative staff in Mexico about, addressing ocean acidification within the legislature. And it is so important that any legislative, staff or office or committee that is interested in taking action have the best available science, and who better to present that than the scientists in the region. So this photo is from a Senate Commission meeting where Martine is presenting on the current understanding of ocean acidification in Mexico, what he sees as the gaps and the needs. And he reflected that it wasn't until he actually was in the room and kind of having these conversations that the government started expressing a lot of interest in his research. And since then, there's been a lot of activity in terms of the executive branches trying to streamline their workflows with the research community in Mexico to better catalog what's happening, to better identify avenues for adaptation and mitigation. And so I think just facilitating that exchange within the appropriate venues is a really key process towards achieving science-based policy. Next slide, please. Kaitlyn mentioned a little bit some of the work the Ocean Foundation does to develop capacity to address ocean acidification. I think if we want to see meaningful policy action, that interdisciplinarity is important, and kind of cultivating or helping people cultivate their own communities of policymakers and scientists and industry members. So something that we aim to do and that we will continue to do as co-champions of this OARS outcome is really try to bring those community and stakeholders together in our training efforts. So for example, these are some photos from a training from a few years ago in Colombia, where we had policymakers, scientists, and kind of seafood industry stakeholders together. And what that enabled is for the scientists who were getting, some of them, their kind of first deep dive into ocean acidification, they were seeing the parallels within the policy communities and the industry immediately and thinking about those connection points. For the policymakers there, they were getting a really great understanding of what does it take to understand ocean acidification. It's perhaps not as simple as they thought. The photo on the left, I love. It's we have, I think it's someone pretty high up in the Ministry of Environment in Venezuela and a number of others in a lab with Martine, who's showing them, you know, the ins and outs of measuring alkalinity, and they didn't want to leave. I had to kick them out. And so I think sometimes people assume that there's these silos and that, you know, people care about what they care about, but the reality is everybody's work is transdisciplinary, and if you can help create those connections through the programming that you do, that's really effective. Next slide, please. So this all, I imagine, sounds a little overwhelming. You know, how do I know where to start? The two co-champions of this outcome, or this OARS outcome 7, have created some tools, and these are not the only tools that exist, but I'm just going to highlight these two as they were developed by the two co-champions. So the first is something that the Commonwealth Blue Charter Action Group on Ocean Acidification. So the way that the Commonwealth Blue Charter is structured is they have a number of action groups focused on various ocean issues. There is an action group on ocean acidification that is led by the government of New Zealand. And they commissioned and produced this excellent policymakers handbook. And in a moment, I'll show you an example of what is in there, but it's really a step-by-step guide to do that inventory, to really assess what are the policy priorities when it comes to ocean acidification. If you are wondering, you know, what does legislation look like? What are the examples? What are the templates? In 2020, we launched an ocean acidification guidebook for policymakers that Bobbi-Jo is actually going to give some highlights from shortly. But this is almost like an annotated bibliography of existing legislative frameworks to understand, well, what are the approaches when you're looking at the actual legal language? What are some templates? What are some examples? So to dive into the resources, the next slide shows just a screenshot of one page of the Commonwealth Handbook, and you can see how hands-on and practical this is. This is just one example of taking inventory, right? And they've sort of filled out a few things, and you can see, okay, what infrastructure do we have in our country that is related to chemical understanding of ocean acidification, biological understanding? You know, how can we leverage that for maybe additional research? And this is just one of the many tools available in this guide, this handbook, I believe is, trying to remember, it's a handbook, right? Theirs is a handbook, ours is a guidebook. The handbook, which they tie it all together, right? And show how each of these pieces link to one another. Next slide, please. I'll just give a brief glimpse of what is, for example, in the guidebook for policymakers, and also share another story. This is a resolution through the Cartagena Convention, which is part of the UN Regional Seas Program. It is a legally binding convention within the broader Caribbean region. And we, the Ocean Foundation, were interested in getting more regional coordination on ocean acidification activities and also commitments from governments. So this is an example of a venue where policy can be introduced, but this is what it looks like, right? So our guidebook goes through examples of, you know, specific legal language. And this is, again, just one example. And we can talk about, you know, how it was that we went about making this happen. And then next slide, this is my final slide is, okay, so you've heard a lot from myself, Jessie, and Kaitlyn, and you'll hear from Bobbi-Jo in just a moment. So where can you begin? Just a few ideas. So conducting a local needs assessment is a great way to start. And there are so many templates, whether the Commonwealth template, the OA Alliance has quite a few templates. And then we actually, the OA Alliance and the Ocean Foundation together created a template that we provided a training on about 1.5 years ago that helps kind of do that stock take. Bridging the science policy divide, right? Creating those avenues for dialogue, organizing a panel perhaps with scientists and policymakers, and building that relationship is key. And then of course, OARS as a program We are a global community. We are working towards the same goals. There are sort of formal ways you can get involved in OARS. It is an endorsed action of the UN Decade, and you can submit an action to be considered to be formally associated with OARS, but there are less formal ways to get involved. And I recommend you reach out to the OARS leadership to learn more about how to get involved. And with that, I will say thank you very much, and I will hand it off to Bobbi-Jo to give us some of these tangible examples of what does legislation look like at different scales.
Thanks, Alexis. Great presentation. And all right, Bobbi-Jo, and I'll just say quickly before Bobbi-Jo's up, if you have questions or comments, go ahead and use whatever's available, whether it's the chat or the Q&A box, and I'll be checking those, and we'll be checking those, and hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes or so for questions before we wrap. So don't be shy. You can go ahead and enter those. All right, Bobbi-Jo, over to you.
All right, thanks, Jessie and Kaitlyn and Alexis. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Bobbi-Jo Dobush. I'm a policy consultant with the Ocean Foundation. And I'm going to build on what my colleagues have talked, excuse me, of course, right now. I'm going to build on what my colleagues have talked about today and really talk about the importance of these different policy approaches for OA at a multi-scale, subnational, national, regional, and global. And I'm going to jump right in and get started. So next slide, please, Jessie. It's important to note that, as you all know, ocean acidification is a global problem. No state or even country stands alone in the fight against ocean acidification. And legislation, regulation, and policy needs to be coordinated across these different levels of government. As Alexis mentioned, there's a handful of incredible tools to help you get started. Whether you're a policymaker or a scientist, you want to jump into this OA science policy interface or just kind of expand what you've been doing for years or decades. Recently, my small slice of this is I helped work on an update to the Ocean Foundation's guidebook, and my comments are informed by that. The guidebook was originally created as a toolkit for policymakers, and it coincided with trainings the Ocean Foundation held in Fiji, Colombia, and Mexico. We are currently expanding it and updating it, and when the update is finalized, it will be available on the website. As you all know, subnational policy has been instrumental in establishing the framework for the science in policy, but also for the appropriations that are so important to create adaptive capacity and reduce risk from ocean acidification and increase resilience. So I'm here today to just give some examples at different policy levels. I want to do a quick disclaimer. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. It's not an exhaustive list of what's in the guidebook either. I tried really to pull some examples I've seen mentioned less frequently in the hopes that even those of you who are really steeped in this policy world might hear about something new or something that would prompt you to think about another angle on what OA policy can look like and can mean. So next slide, please, Jessie. I'm going to start broad. I'm going to start global and then kind of work my way down in. So these are just some international frameworks. Some of these are, the usual suspects, obvious things you would think about in relation to ocean acidification. And some I just wanted to raise as potentially outside of the box of how we normally think about this. Again, not exhaustive. The UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change, was something I really want to talk about is the Ocean Climate Dialogue, which was held for the first time in December 2020 virtually, and was the first forum for parties and also non-party stakeholders to give their perspectives on how climate regimes should address ocean-related mitigation and adaptation. Very cool, almost 2/3 of the submissions mentioned ocean acidification, and it was a big topic in the first dialogue. In Glasgow at COP26 this year, it was decided the dialogue would happen regularly, and the next dialogue is happening this June in Bonn. Hopefully this dialogue can serve as a forum to advance the conversation on ocean acidification policies at all levels. The Convention on Biological Diversity, I just want to say that the CBD has long acknowledged ocean acidification. Since 2008, they adopted 2 decisions, one requesting an analysis on the relationships on various stressors on marine biodiversity, and the other requesting a synthesis of the science of the effects of ocean acidification on marine biodiversity. Something to watch is the upcoming Conference of the Parties, which begins next month. UNCLOS, or the Law of the Sea. Two really interesting things are happening. Well, interesting if you're a policy nerd. One is right now, literally right now, an agreement is being negotiated for biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, BBNJ. There's the 4th negotiating session occurring, and this draft text of this treaty that hopefully will be finalized has multiple references to ocean acidification as it stands now. And the treaty could positively affect ocean acidification in 2 ways. One, by enhancing ocean resilience via protected areas on the high seas, and 2, by requiring evaluation of cumulative impacts for any proposed activities on the high seas. And of course, that would include ocean acidification. Another entity that falls under UNCLOS and sometimes falls off of our radar, or at least mine, is the International Seabed Authority. In short, the ISA is tasked with regulating seabed in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And what that tends to mean now is seabed mining or potential seabed mining. Right now, currently, the ISA is working toward creating regulations for this mineral exploitation. Part of that is designing the environmental assessment process. For example, whether and how changes to the chemical composition of the ocean will need to be monitored and reported if seabed mining were to go forward. So that's something also, if you're interested, to keep your eye on. Super briefly, there's a lot going on with human rights and climate. There's developing policy and legal scholarship, and in the future, legal challenges, including in relation to migration and food security, which is obviously tied to ocean acidification, are likely to become increasingly common. Lastly, I don't need to talk to this group about the Sustainable Development Goals, but just if you didn't know, more than 250 voluntary commitments related to ocean acidification are posted as part of the Communities of Ocean Action for SDG 14.3. It's very cool if you feel like browsing through that. Next slide, please. So regional ocean acidification actions, it's incredible how many regional ocean acidification actions are. And as my colleagues have talked about previously, this goes from treaties and conventions to science programs to go on, of course, and then all the way down to, how do I say this, to coordinating bodies that weren't necessarily created to focus on the science, were created to focus on something else about a regional sea, and ended up realizing how important the chemical composition of the ocean was to whatever their original goal was. So just a couple ones I want to mention. The Convention on the Protection of the Marine Environment of the Northeast Atlantic, OSPAR, has been paying attention to OA for a long time, since at least 2010. You know, they had OA integrated into their materials, but they're new. Just last year, they put out the Environment Strategy through 2030, where ocean acidification features heavily. 3 of their 12 strategic objectives relate to climate change and ocean acidification. In the Nairobi Convention, the proposed work program for the period that we're currently in has a lot of focus on ocean acidification. In the Regional Organization for the Conservation of Environment in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, PERSCA, intergovernmental body with a focus on the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, obviously. They focus on blue carbon and also have consistently hosted workshops, including on ocean acidification in the region. COBSEA, the coordinating body on the seas of East Asia, is the regional intergovernmental mechanism bringing together 9 countries to talk about the development and protection of the marine environment and coastal areas in East Asian seas. They've recognized ocean acidification as a key stressor and called for greater scientific cooperation to monitor pH levels. And I have here the logo for SPREP. They've been involved in a bunch of different things, including with the Commonwealth and on their own, and a lot of different collaborations. There's so much. There's so much in the guidebook. If you're interested in wondering in a certain region in the world, how do I jump in? Who would I contact? It's a great place to start. Personally, I learned a lot looking through and updating that. There's more than you could talk about in an entire hour. It's really exciting stuff. Next slide, please. So national laws and policies. as we've discussed already today, there's so many things when you start to think of OA as a broader topic, all of the different ways you can affect this work. So national laws and policies can look like a lot of different stuff when you're searching for them, but I want to talk about a couple buckets, for lack of a better word. One is climate action laws, policies, and plans. For example, Fiji recently passed an extremely ambitious climate change act, acknowledging that climate change presents a number of risks to the marine environment, including bleaching, ocean acidification, loss of biodiversity, and deoxygenation. I think it's cool because I don't know that a decade ago, any legislation would have been that specific about the ocean stressors. And ocean acidification also features in Fiji's National Adaptation Plan and National Ocean Policy and is named as such, which is pretty great. In Chile, they have a climate change plan for fish and aquaculture, which directly recognizes ocean acidification as a major threat and proposes capacity development to address it. Another kind of bucket of national laws and policies is working to integrate climate change into a country's international reporting, for example, nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, and under the Convention for Biological Diversity, the plans that are submitted there or the proposals. For example, under the NDCs, 14 countries pledged to address ocean acidification in their first NDCs, and a 2021 interim report on the revised NDCs that was put out by the Ocean and Climate Platform found that an increase in NDCs that are recognizing multiple pressures to the ocean, including ocean acidification. The last set of policies, or the last bucket, is legally mandated funding or appropriations. And of course that matters because reliable funding supports ongoing multi-year monitoring and robust data collection. Next slide, please. So as we've talked about today, subnational governments have really led on the ocean acidification front, especially here where I am in the US, but I think a lot of places in the world. Many states, territories, provinces, tribes, tribal nations, and other subnational entities have made huge strides regarding ocean acidification and have really led the charge in a lot of ways. 2 tribal nations have established their own ocean acidification action plans. Several tribes in the Pacific Northwest have taken a key role in addressing ocean acidification. Across the US, from Hawaii to New Jersey, states are paying attention to ocean acidification, creating plans, setting aside funding. Even cities and ports have jumped on board. Vancouver has made a voluntary commitment regarding the city's ocean acidification framework, and the Port of Seattle was the first port in the world in 2020 to join the OA Alliance and create its own ocean acidification plan. So again, thank you, for listening. I hope you heard about at least one thing you might not have heard about before, and that you get a sense of some of the examples of the breadth of the different ways that OA policy can be put a little more meat on the idea of what could it actually look like to take science to policy and welcome the science into our decision making. That's it for me. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Bobbi-Jo. And it's great to see that the policy compendium is going to be released and updated. And I agree, a great place to start, sort of thumb through and get inspirations, if not specific tools and texts. I think it's cool to see the body of literature on the policy space be growing as well. So thank you for that. All right, well, let's see. I'm going to stop my share. And if our panelists will come back, or our presenters will come back to us. We only have a couple more minutes, but I've got a couple questions that I think we can tackle before we all have to hang up. I think I should say first, if you want to be involved in the OARS program or learn more about the OARS program, please reach out to either the OARS coordinators on the UN Decade website, or I believe my email is in the Zoom email that you got to sign up and register. So that's a fine place, and then I can do the right connecting if all else fails, but probably the UN Decade website will have grid information. So quick question, I'm going to ask Alexis if you'll be able to take it. So cooperation with the Commonwealth was mentioned. Is there any cooperation with the European Union, and specifically listing examples like the, oh gosh, help me out, Alexis.
Let me find it. Oh, the Copernicus Earth Observation Project.
That's
So
that's
I
okay.
would say that broadly speaking, the OA community is very international and very well coordinated. I will say that there's quite a bit of leadership on the OARS outcomes from Europe. I don't know specifically if there's anyone involved in the Copernicus Earth Observation Project, but yes, I would say we have great coordination with scientists based in the EU, with governments in the EU in general. And the EU was a champion of some of the early ocean acidification kind of research coordination work. I think it was APOCA is what it was called, the European Project on Ocean. I can't remember exactly, but there's been some great work led by the EU in the past. And I think some of the work we're doing now is a legacy of that.
Thanks, Alexis. Okay, one question that maybe I'll take first and then open up if anyone wants to add. A question is, how should policymakers consider climate justice issues around OA policymaking? And I guess I can give the broadest answer of that, which is like any climate change impact, it is caused by global carbon, well, in this case, global carbon dioxide emissions, but a global problem that's going to have unique and disparate impacts in different regions for different reasons. And really, when you start to think about the vulnerability mapping around sociocultural impacts, as Kaitlyn was mentioning, thinking about communities, industries that are very dependent on viable coastal resources, viable marine resources, and that disparate impact of ocean acidification, in addition to other accelerants like warming and loss of oxygen, start to really paint a picture of a unequal, sort of unjust way that global communities are going to experience impacts of ocean acidification and broadly climate change. I think the most recent IPCC AR6 working group report 2 contribution really highlighted that disparate impact on human communities that we're going to continue to see accelerated from climate change impacts. So that's broad. Anyone else want to add to that, particularly around OA?
I would say that there's been effort, at least in the US, around vulnerability assessments that are looking to really identify some of these disparate impacts and make recommendations. That's something that's happening in the US. I'd say at the global level, there's a lot of conversation about who is responsible for paying for adaptation and mitigation, and sort of from a global equity in terms of polluting nations versus non-historically polluting nations. And I think that we as an OA community certainly try and think about that as well.
Great. And one final question, because I know we're at the top of the hour. The question is, we hear quite a few US projects to restore bivalve, in this particular example, mollusk beds for adaptation and to provide income to coastal communities. However, to what extent are these projects or projects like this considering acidification? Kaitlyn, you're kind of nodding. Do you want to add anything? And go ahead.
I don't think I can speak to any projects in particular, but I can imagine most folks that are working on bivalves and mollusks these days have oceanification at the top of their mind. Whether that's considering where the best places to site these sorts of projects are, considering local oceanographic factors, whether there's the potential to raise the young life stages in a hatchery where perhaps the seawater can be buffered and maybe get some of these more sensitive species over that first initial bottleneck in terms of their life stage where they're potentially most vulnerable. So I think there's also other thoughts about co-locating some of these species, perhaps around kelp or other photosynthetic organisms. I think the research probably is still determining to what extent these co-location experiments can have in terms of benefits, but perhaps something that's always at the top of mind when thinking about how to do this work in the future.
Thanks, Kaitlyn. And one thing I'd add to that additionally is there are pilots and evaluations around crushed up shell matter, or sort of thinking about shell dissolution techniques around different calcifiers or shell, what's the word, reclamation projects, and kind of buffering some of the existing beds or lines with recycled shell. I think there's some anxiety, or there are some areas where that will not work based upon viruses or potential bacteria co-location, but that's not true in all locations. And that is one type of sort of adaptation resilience building strategy that have emerged around the world as potentially useful. So with that, I think we probably don't have tons of time. I appreciate everyone. I know we all appreciate everyone joining in and being part of this OA community of practice. And you can really see as the research is continuing to grow and expand, we are getting closer to starting to think about how it's going to be applied and useful at a local level. And then also, what are the policy scales and investment scales, the financing that's going to be needed to get at this different information gradients for different reasons: global information, regional information, local information, and that's going to look different, and that we're up to the challenge of helping to define those different spheres with you. So thank you all for joining. Again, plugging the OARS event that's taking place tomorrow at Kaitlyn. Tell us the time.
8 a.m. Central European Time.
Great. And yeah, please stay in touch with us, and we'll make sure to make this available to those who've missed it, or if you want to watch it again, and really appreciate your time.
I will also note that if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to follow up with us. I see Kaitlyn's typing back to Wiley, had a really good question about fisheries management. And I wonder if this is something that Wiley, the Sentinel site work in Washington, might be interesting, because I think they were talking to tribes about management of fisheries based on projections. So that might be something that you look at. But please, if we didn't get to your question, feel free to email us and we'll do our best.
Yeah. Lovely. Well, thanks all. And thank you, co-host Ocean Foundation. Great set of presentations. Really appreciate it. All right, guys. Well, I'll go ahead and save the chat, and yeah, sending good energy for the rest of the week.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.